Good afternoon. Chair, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and a pleasure for me to be here at this prestigious summit on such a vital issue for humanity at this time. As a first-time attendant to the summit in Delhi, let me say how impressed I am with this quality of this event. And I thank you for associating Africa and the African Development Bank to the summit. I also wish to thank the Government of India and the city of Delhi for the hospitality. And our special thanks to Professor Pachauri for his tireless efforts and pioneering work in this respect. This would have been the first time Professor Pachauri approached me to come here, and I think I was beginning to make enemies with him. I think this time round I've made peace with him. So please pass on the message to him. The Delhi Summit has become such a landmark in the defense of the global commons and for raising the alarm at the alacrity with which humanity is marching towards the planetary boundaries. This is not a place for me to restate what science tells us. The increased pressure on natural capital due to population increase, consumption patterns, and plain bad policies. I just saw Thomas Friedman here. I think he walked out. I know he'll be speaking at this conference. In an article in the Herald Tribune, he made an interesting comparison between the whole conversation on the fiscal cliffs and what he called the climate cliff. Humanity, or at least the wealthier part of it, is not only accumulating unsustainable finances, but also unsustainable carbon debt, he said. We can all agree. And he asked the question, what would it take for us to price scarce resources to reflect their scarcity through such thing as a carbon tax? Friends, in 1992, the Rio Summit drew the attention to the essentials of a three-point agenda: climate change, biodiversity, drought, and desertification. At this same summit last year, you discussed action needed to defend the global commons. And it was clear that 20 years after Rio, action remains underwhelming. Our natural resources are now under more pressure than ever. And nowhere is this more acute than in my own continent, in Africa. As a result of population growth, sustained economic growth, and urbanization over the last 10 years. A study conducted by the African Development Bank and the World Wildlife Foundation shows a dramatic growth in Africa's ecological footprint over the last 50 years, an increase of 240%. This has led to rapid degradation of the ecosystems which underpin and sustain livelihood and hence deepening poverty. You will all have seen the crisis in the Horn of Africa and the rest of the Sahel, from the Indian part of the Sahel to the Atlantic Ocean, which shows part of the broader ramifications on water resources, on agriculture and food security, and even on security as such. No one can seriously suggest in this room that Africans on aggregate use more resources than the land on which they live can provide. Africans can be accused of many things, but not this one. Yet, it is also a fact that this is a continent suffering the most severe effects from the degradation of natural capital. In addition, this is a continent with the lowest carbon emissions in absolute terms and per capita terms, and the most limited adaptive capacity. It is now clear to all of us that the political will and the compromise needed to reach an international deal on climate change, on climate finance, remains limited. So is action on the two other elements of Rio, biodiversity and desertification. And in the intervening period, vulnerability of Africa's agriculture, livestock, fisheries, transport, health increase every day. So what are the choices? For us, the answer is straightforward, and that is how best to avoid locking African countries into poverty-deepening, unsustainable development pathways, costly, difficult to reverse, in an increasingly fragile ecosystem. Since the turn of the millennium, the growth pulses in Africa have picked up dramatically. Despite the rapid depletion of the natural capital, much of Africa still has a sizable level of natural resources: land, water, forest, fisheries, hydropower resources, and other renewables. However, on current trends, they will deplete very quickly. The question, therefore, is one of making the smart choices for sustainability, providing a policy environment to that end, while combining public and private sector innovation required. Several African countries are already engaged on that path, fully embedding green plans in country strategies to foster economic growth that ensures natural assets continue to provide the resources on which human welfare relies. Chair, friends, as I just pointed out, after decades of stagnation in per capita incomes, where Africa was a laggard in terms of economic growth, Africa has demonstrated a new dynamism. The global economic crisis and the recession had an impact, but a brief one. I expect 2/3 of African economies south of the Sahara to grow in 2013 at 6.2%. This is still below the 7% needed to begin making a strong impact on poverty, but it is a remarkable performance nonetheless. It is a strong performance driven by good policies, demographic dynamics, robust public and private sector demand, investment flows, and of course, commodity demand from emerging markets. While the risks of reversals always lurch around the corner, I am persuaded that the systems are now in place to robustly mitigate for major policy reversals. The overarching risk, however, remains that of sustainability. And that takes several forms, as Mr. Kuroda was just mentioning. The most important of which we share with our colleagues in Asia, being inclusiveness, inequalities, and jobs, and of course, natural capital. And that's why the African Development Bank and its new long-term strategy is focused on those two issues: inclusion and building resilience, which means adaptation to climate change and preserving Africa's bountiful natural resources and utilizing them in an efficient way to tackle poverty. The strategy seeks to ensure broad-based growth and the creation of jobs. We seek to take maximum advantage of opportunities offered through low carbon intensive growth paths to build resilience in the livelihood of poor people, providing for sustainable infrastructure, energy for all, addressing emerging urbanization challenges. Before I come to the end of my statement, Chair, let me return to the issue which I consider the most urgent for us on the African continent, and that is addressing Africa's power crisis and access to energy for all. On my continent, per capita availability of energy is under 300 kilowatt hours per person. In rich countries, the figure is 15,000 kilowatt hours per person. It is therefore obvious that all available resources have to be tapped, subject, of course, to the economics of it. While several regions of Africa are not well endowed, large parts of the continent still have plenty of hydro potential, of which only less than 10% have so far been developed. But there remains millions of African citizens as a nation who have no access to green energy or to any energy at all. That is why I strongly welcome Mr. Ban Ki-moon's initiative on energy for all. It is a feasible goal. Sustainability is not possible until no part of humanity is condemned to darkness or lack of clean water. We will play our part. We seek partnership from public and private sector in this region. India has tremendous experience on smart energy and accessible, simple technologies. The African Development Bank will draw on its resources its operational experience and knowledge now available to advance that agenda of rural electrification, rural water and sanitation, development of renewables, where, of course, the economics make sense. Over the next 5 years, the bank will invest around $7 billion to support climate-resilient development, renewable energy, sustainable transport, smart agriculture, smart land and water management. I'm here in Delhi to seek partnership from this community for that inclusive agenda. Let me end these remarks, Chair, with an observation. Chair, I don't know how old you are, but as a young university graduate student in the United Kingdom in the late 70s, I recall watching the then British Prime Minister, James Callaghan, on TV. It was then black and white TV. He was holding a microchip in his hand and observing the challenge which that will pose for jobs. The rest, as they say, is history. We know how many jobs the IT revolution has actually created. I've often heard the proposition that resource-efficient growth would undermine jobs. To the contrary, like many of you here, I feel that resource-efficient agenda is job-creating and offers opportunity to lift millions out of poverty in a lasting way. We all subscribe, of course, to the doctrine of no size fits all, as initiated by the OECD. Low-income countries will face a whole range of different problems in a more acute way, from youth unemployment, energy poverty, poor access to clean water, low productivity agriculture, and paucity of decent jobs. They would therefore be expected to marshal all the resources in an efficient way, but in a flexible, pragmatic manner. African people, like millions in low-income countries, in their quest for eliminating absolute poverty, to create opportunities for their people, recognize that a resource-efficient agenda is the right place to begin. They recognize the opportunities created by harnessing the bountiful nature rather than undermining it. And for a continent whose livelihood is closely tied to nature, that is the essence of sustainability. And I want to assure you that the African Development Bank and African countries in general will be a trusted partner in this noble endeavor. I thank you for inviting me and for listening to me. Thank you.